Before COVID, I was playing 2 to 4 shows a week, every single week. And I had a set of drums that just lived in the trunk of my car, except for the bass drum, which I would carry on my back to and from my apartment after the gig.
But the band is still too loud.
Shutdown happened, all shows stopped. And it gave me time to really think about exactly what I wanted from my live kit. The main thing is it has to be totally adaptable to a whole bunch of styles. These are mostly shows where they're kind of one-offs. I show up and play whatever the gig is. So this is kind of my Swiss Army knife drum set. I can show up to just about any gig and be able to cover with what's in the trunk of my car. Here's the criteria this kit has to fit. It has to sound great. I want real drum sizes, not little tiny bass drums and little tiny toy toms. It has to look great. It has to look great in a really wide range of settings. You know, a billionaire's wedding or a grungy basement or, you know, anything in between. I want to be able to carry the entire kit in 2 trips, no more. And it has to be as lightweight as I can get it. It has to set up and tear down as quickly as possible because, you know, at the end of a long show, I want to get out of there. Here's the gig that kind of encapsulated what I want out of this kit. I was playing a very expensive wedding on the side of a mountain where I had to haul all these drums across a muddy field in a tuxedo, set up on a tight stage with a 10-piece band, and cover a really wide range of music going back to the 30s up until, you know, yesterday's hit music. And this is the kit I've arrived at. Ludwig drums, Sabian cymbals, Aquarian heads, innovative sticks and beaters, TnR mounts, and a whole bunch of small details from some smaller companies making great stuff. I've arrived at some very specific sizes over 30 years of playing shows, and I'll show you exactly what those are. Also, there are some details that help reduce the weight of the drums and reduce the footprint of the kit. This is very important on a small stage when you're basically just trying to piss off all your other musicians equally because they have to try to set up around a set of drums. There are a zillion Ludwig Blue Sparkle kits out there going back 100 years. This one is very custom. And it's blue sparkle because it always looks classy and my sorry colorblind eyes can see it. I have my trusty cymbal bag full of a selection of Sabian's HH, HHX, and Artisan series, which cover everything I need to cover. We're now 2 decades into the 21st century, and it shocks me that drummers still show up without a carpet. Go to your local hardware store, home improvement store, $25. Get one, keep it in the trunk of your car. To make my setup as quick as possible, I've added these tape marks where the bass drum spurs go so that I can show up, throw the rug down, put my bass drum right in its place, and not have to think about where it's positioned on the rug. My main kick drum is a 12 by 22 inch Ludwig Classic Maple, and I absolutely love this size, especially for live work because it has all the low end you need. It's really punchy because of that 12-inch depth, and it just takes up less stage space. You know, these modern kits with 18-inch and 20-inch deep bass drums, a lot of times your bandmates would actually rather have that space to themselves instead of, you know, a giant cannon bass drum. This size works. Some custom details on this drum. The tension casings are Ludwig's small classic casings, and they're a little lighter than the large classic casings that would be on a standard Ludwig stock bass drum of this configuration. In the spirit of lowering the weight of this drum, I also have the old school tom mount, as well as the folding wing spurs. On both spurs, I have memory locks, so setting up is really easy. You just put them in position and you're good to go. I've added an INDe BR3 bracket for those times I want to add a cowbell or small hi-hats, but don't want to set up another stand. An important detail on this bass drum that you probably won't see from the audience side is the Kelly Shoe internal bass drum mounting system that's holding an Audix D6 microphone right now. I have it permanently mounted in the drum. Sound techs love it because they just plug an XLR straight into the shell. Band members love it because there is no mic stand for them to kick. And I love it because they're not ripping my front head every time they kick that mic stand that used to be there. Aquarian heads, of course, and the drum is muffled with a Drum Workshop pillow. On the bass drum hoop, I'm using the Twin Cities Drum Collective Hoop Protect. It's this little rubber piece that just slides right onto the hoop, and it gives some extra bite to your pedal, protects the finish. My trusty DW5000 pedal, and I use the innovative Percussion. This is the KDB BP beater as my main beater. For quieter gigs, I use the innovative Cloud beater. Super poofy, great low end, and just really mellows out the attack. For the gigs where a much smaller bass drum is needed, such as, you know, a cocktail jazz gig or a really quiet singer-songwriter gig, I have this little 10 by 18 bass drum. This started life as a marching tom in the 1970s. When I got it, there was no bottom head, no holes, so I drilled out the holes, added bottom hardware, added a second head. I'm using Ludwig's Atlas mounts to add wing spurs, and this cool little plastic lifter which gets it off the ground so the beater hits right in the center of the head. It sounds great, it works really well, and it matches my brand new Ludwig kit. The rack tom is my favorite size, an 8x12, a classic going back 100 years for a good reason. It just works. This one has small classic casings, Ludwig's Vibraband suspension mount. One important detail is I replaced the standard 2.3mm steel hoops with 1.6mm steel hoops from Drum Factory Direct. Drum hoops on vintage drums were thinner and lighter, and for me, switching out to these thinner and lighter hoops, it actually kind of lowers the pitch a little bit of the drum, and of course, it's lighter to carry, which really counts for a lot in when you're, you know, hauling drums around for a one-nighter. Heads by Aquarian, coated Super 2 on top, smooth white, classic clear underneath. On both the rack tom and the floor tom, I'm using these little SnareWeight M1 mufflers. They just have a nice smooth dampening effect without feeling artificial, and they feel very organic to me, maybe because they're made out of leather. I have this leather pad which protects the shell of the rack tom from rubbing against the snare drum. You will see a lot of vintage drums where they have what's called a rack rash or snare rash, where it's a section where the rubbing is actually rubbed through the covering of the drum and gets down to bare wood. It can be kind of ugly. There's a really easy way to prevent that. One more cool detail. This is a tom mount from NOMO and Cooley. It's their cool mount. Basically, you set it up once, and then all you have to do is pull the drum out. You don't have to unscrew anything. To install it, you just slot it in the hole. Every second counts when you're trying to get out the door after a 5-hour gig. Next up, the floor tom is my absolute favorite size for live shows. It's a 14 by 15 inch head, Ludwig Classic Maple. It also has the small classic casings. It has old school tom mounts and legs, which are thinner and lighter than the modern version. All 3 legs have memory locks, so once again, setup is fast and easy, and it just sets up the same way every time. On the leg that's closest to me, I have a piece of tape, and that's just so when I'm pulling these out of the hardware case, trying to set up quickly, I can see at a glance which one goes in the bracket that's closest to me so the tom is tilted the right way. On the legs, I'm using Pearl's rubber suspension tips, which just really help the tone and sustain of the drum. The heads on the floor tom are the same, coated Super 2 on top, Classic Clear underneath. And that's going to allow you to see something that's kind of ugly to look at, but it does a lot for the tone. Especially for drums that don't have any reinforcing hoops on the inside and it's just hard sealed wood. You can really easily get kind of a basketball pinging sound. A lot of the times, the more expensive the drum it is, the worse the pinging is because, you know, the wood is hard and it keeps those, the vibrations bouncing the drum. So I have this scrap of one of my son's old t-shirts, and I just cut a little strip out of it and install it with using the existing screws inside the drum. It immediately takes that ping away and actually just kind of improves the low end of the drum. I have a little one in the rack tom as well, which you can't see, but it's just a little strip held in place by the mounting screws for the tension brackets. This particular configuration, the 8x12, 14x15, and 12x22, is a configuration that I've arrived at from going through a lot of drum kits over the years, trying to get the kit as compact as possible while still having a full low end, full response, but take up as little stage space as possible. And I find this really works, especially because there's a 3-inch difference between the toms. Getting a good pitch spread is easy to do. 14-inch floor toms to me are a little too high and doingy. 16-inch floor toms live I find the low end just gets swallowed up by the bass cabinet and the guitar and everything else, where they kind of get lost in the mix. Where a 15-inch just pitches it low enough that, it's clearly a floor tom, but not so low that it gets buried in the mix. I'm just a big fan of this configuration, and I'm really glad that Ludwig worked with me to build exactly this kit. It really works, and try these sizes yourself. You'll like them. With my mantra of keeping things as light and compact as possible, I'm using the Gibraltar flat-based snare drum stands. They don't weigh much, hold your drum just fine. One really important detail, though, is the True Vibes isolation mount, which I don't own a single snare drum stand that doesn't have these things. The sonic difference with these suspension mounts on your snare stand, or if you have a mounted rack tom, there's so much more low end and sustain. They're really inexpensive. I've had these on here for easily 1,000 shows, and they're indestructible. They work. Get some. Back in the 90s, one of my teachers, a world-famous studio drummer, was telling me about snare drums for the studio when I was asking. And his point was, if you only have one snare drum, bring a Ludwig Superphonic. And if you only have 2, bring a Ludwig Acrolite with it. That stuck with me for a long time, and I think he's right. That's what I bring on these gigs. I use the Superphonic for kind of the higher pitched, modern pop or breakbeat oriented, anything where you want kind of a tight, high pitched snare drum sound. And I use the Acrolite for pretty much anything else. Rock and roll, singer-songwriter, blues, modern country. My Ludwig Superphonic is almost exactly as old as I am, or I should say as young as I am. It's a 10-lug drum, aluminum shell, chrome plated. I'm using the Aquarian high frequency with a power dot underneath. This is their thinnest head. The power dot gives it a little extra strength for one thing, but it also kind of tightens up the fundamental. I'm usually using it with the muffler pretty heavily cranked. And like I said, this is for the kind of tighter modern pop stuff. I've had my Ludwig Acrolite since the early 90s. This is just one of the most all-around useful drums there is, in my opinion. 8-lug aluminum shell. On mine, the internal muffler was gone, so I used a SnareWeight. I've replaced the original strainer, which didn't work very well from too much use, with one of the INDe strainers, which fit the original holes perfectly and works beautifully. For gigs where I'm covering a lot of sonic ground, for example, a wedding where I'm playing stuff from the 1920s up till, the hits from today, I will carry 2 snare stands so that I can have the 2 drums at my disposal depending on the song.